Hi, this is Mrs. Anderson, and today I wanted to give you some background information on the next work that we're reading, Cyrano de Bergerac. So as you can tell from the slides that I have chosen, this takes place in France. And since we're not French and we're not living during the 1600s when this book was set, I was afraid it may be a little foreign for you, no pun intended. So today I'm going to talk to you about the politics, the art scene, regionalism, and the status of women in France in the 1600s. So let's start with the politics. First, let me apologize for my anachronistic use of the Eiffel Tower in this presentation. I realized that it was not in France in the 1600s, but hopefully it serves as a visual reminder of where this book is set. And one of the things you do need to know about France during the 1600s is that the person in charge was a king, King Louis XIII. And actually, he was not much older than you are when he became King of France. And I'm sure you could assume that could be problematic. After all, does somebody really want a teenager in charge of a country? So the way that they rectified that as a country was to make sure that he had a powerful advisor, somebody named Cardinal Richelieu, who was behind the scenes heavily influencing the king. So the reason why that's important is because you have to realize anybody who wanted anything recognized that they had to influence and befriend Cardinal Richelieu in order to get anything done. So what we will continually see in Cyrano is not so much a mention of King Louis, but a mention of Richelieu as someone that people revered, but at the same time feared because of how much power and influence he had over the young king. Okay, so let's move on to the art scene. And what I want to talk to you about first is a very unique and special kind of individual called a précieuse. And this was something that was in France during the 1600s, and it would have been a member of the upper class that was passionate about manners, proper speech, and poetry, especially wordplay. However, these individuals were not viewed positively by everyone. By people who were true artists, they felt like these précieuses were posers because, after all, look at their idea of a good time. The précieuses would get dressed up in their Sunday best and meet at a friend's house in order to recite poetry that they didn't write to each other and swoon. So because précieuses really enjoyed wordplay and words but couldn't produce the work themselves, they were looked down by real artists. So we are talking about art right now, and one of the important things to be an artist is the idea that if it's your job, you should be able to support yourself. But as you may have heard the term starving artist, it's not always easy to do. So a lot of the times, an artist would have patronage, or that's when someone provides economic support for an artist to do his or her work. If you're familiar with the Renaissance period, we've heard of the Medici family, who were great patrons of the art and provided a lot of money so that artists could create. That's one of the positives of having a patron, is that the artist gets money to do what he or she loves in order to create great art. However, there is a negative side as well. Consider that the artist loses some control over the creative process because now the patron has a right to determine what the art will be. A good way to think of this is a wedding band. They're musicians, they're artists. So if you are in a wedding band, you're going to have to play the music that the bride and the groom want. So it doesn't matter if you have a particular musical taste. You may find yourself playing the hokey pokey and the chicken dance all night because those are popular with crowds and at weddings. So now let's move on to this idea of regionalism, which was very important in France at the time of Cyrano de Bergerac. If you've not heard of regionalism before, it's devotion or loyalty to a particular region, and you may wonder, how does this apply to France? Well, at the time that this book was written, the country was divided up into provinces, 34 to be exact, and each province or region had its own traditions, customs, and coat of arms. So because each region had its own customs and traditions, what began to happen is that individuals developed specific accents, skills, or traits based on his or her province or region. And if you think about it, it makes sense. If you happen to live in an area of France where there's a lot of vineyards, then one of the skills that you could develop is winemaking. So in Cyrano, what you will soon recognize is while the French are loyal to their country, they're devoted to their birthplace. And they're not always welcome to outsiders from other provinces or regions. One of the ways that you'll see this in Cyrano is through an individual's military unit. So because your military unit was determined by one's birthplace, Cyrano, who's from Gascony, is a Gascon soldier, but he's not super accepting of anyone who wants to be a Gascon who was not born in Gascony. I'd like to point out that this sense of regionalism is not something that we see just in France. Think of today in California, the difference between Northern versus Southern California. And if you don't think regionalism exists there, try to go to a San Francisco Giants game wearing a Dodgers hat and see what happens. The last thing I'm going to talk about is the role of women, and it may be symbolic that I put this slide last because, after all, once again, we are going to see that women had almost no political rights. They could not vote or hold office at this time. They were considered passive citizens. They did receive an education, but that was in learning to be a good wife and raise future citizens. However, all is not lost upon women at this time. They did have roles within their family and community that allowed them to influence the political system. They often served as counselors within their household and within their community that allowed them to temper their husbands' or their father's opinions. So now that we've discussed a little bit about the politics, the art scene, regionalism, and the role of women in France at this time, what I'm going to ask you to think about next is how do you think identity, power, and other anti-bias skills we've discussed this year apply to Cyrano? So I look forward to that discussion, and I will see you soon.